Welcome
Yeah.
everyone. My name is Frederik Six from the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam and also the GOVTRUST Center at the University of Antwerp. This is a webinar that we do regularly for the people to have the different chapters of the handbook present their findings, the authors of the different chapters. We started just before the summer, so now we're picking it back up in the autumn. I was one of the editors, and the different editors will chair different sessions. To start with, and I need to, for a second, go to the email with the information. The next webinar, and we will also post it on LinkedIn and other places, will be on Wednesday, the 22nd of October, so in just over 3 weeks, from 9 to 10 Central European Time. Central Eastern Time. No, hang on, is this the right time?
European
it's
time.
Americans.
European time.
European time, but Americans presenting at 9 a.m. European time. Anyway.
So we have Australia, New Zealand and America in the same, and Europe in the same
Otago,
webinar.
New Zealand. Yes, I see.
Yes.
Sorry about this. The chapter will be participatory engagement, 3 potential pathways for impacting public trust in institutions. By Lisa and Mariska. Lisa from Pitlick from University of Nebraska and Mariska Kapmeijer from University of Otago in New Zealand. As I say, there will be more, and you will also find this information elsewhere. We will promote it in the next weeks. This week, this webinar, Valerie Braithwaite will present. Valerie, emeritus professor in Australia, and she's written a lot about trust, edited books on trust, and also on regulation, and she will present her chapter on trust and trustworthiness dynamics applied to a case, the Robodebt case in Australia, and also linking it to her work on motivational postures. So it is about what, and it is a argument, a chapter on how you can become a trustworthy government and what it takes to be and stay a trustworthy government. Now, before I do that, we go there. I will share my screen and we will, and I will give you a quick overlook of the whole book. You see the presentation?
Yes, we are good.
Good. Then the handbook. We had a couple of guiding principles for the handbook as we were designing it. And the editors were, apart from me, also Koen Verhoest, Joe Ham, Dominika Latusek, and Esther van Zimmeren. So we wanted to look at both causes, dynamics, and effects of trust and distrust in public governance. So a lot of stuff, elements. We also were very adamant we wanted a cross-disciplinary approach, even though public governance has the public administration, public management, journals and domains. We also went to natural resource management, judicial, and other disciplines because there's a lot of relevant research being done there. We took a multi-level perspective, which is also important, and we took a multi-actor perspective. And overall, we highlighted that the centrality of trust in enhancing resilience, effectiveness, and the legitimacy of governance systems. Now, the book consists of 4, and attention to trust, distrust, and trust repair. Now, the book consists of 4 parts. The first part was understanding key concepts and processes of trust and distrust. And we leaned heavily on big names, and we're very fortunate and happy that they contributed in the general trust research field. So we looked at vulnerability, which is central to trust. We looked at trust and distrust in institutions, to institutional contradictions and how they make building trust sustainably more difficult. The governance of private and public service organizations, external relationships, learning to trust, an interesting chapter on the impact of education on how kids learn to trust, a chapter on repairing trust, on algorithmic governance, and a chapter on methodological considerations and approaches. Then the second part, we followed the trias politica in a multi-level governance perspective. So we looked at trust in political and legislative actors and systems, at trust in courts and judicial systems, at citizens' trust in public administration. And then on top, because you'd see what you'd think, why 5 chapters if there's only 3 in the trias, we also looked at the multi-level governance perspective and at trust dynamics in federal systems. Part 3, we looked at multidisciplinary perspectives, so different disciplines on citizen-government relationships. So Valerie Braithwaite's chapter starts that part. Then we looked at power vulnerability through a lens of feminist intersectionality. We looked at trust identity and place-based environmental governance, at corruption and political trust, at participatory engagement, the next webinar, at crisis and what happens to trust in a crisis. You have to rally around the flag effect, but if the crisis sustains itself for longer, what happens then? And we reverse. Yeah, all these other chapters are citizen trust in different aspects of government. And the last chapter is public officials' trust in citizens, a very much under-researched topic. The final part is about trust between and within public organizations. So we have trust and regulation. We have trust in public networks and public-private partnerships. We have trust in government contracting, so those are more external relations, so between public organizations, and then 2 within public organizations, trust, control, motivation in public organizations, and trust and public sector work, looking at how public service motivation impacts on trust. So those are the chapters. I will stop sharing. And I will hand over, hang on, wrong way, stop presenting. And I'm very happy to hand over to Valerie. Valerie, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit more, feel free to do so. And all the audience, you can put questions in the chat, and afterwards we'll do a Q&A until 11 o'clock Central European time. Valerie, it's over to you.
Thank you, Frederick. Thank you. Well, first and foremost, my thanks to the editors of the Handbook on Trust in Public Governance, particularly to Frederick and Joe, who were my handlers for this very ambitious volume. Thank you for the invitation to participate and their wise guidance throughout. Now, my interest in trust norms goes back to the mid-1990s when Margaret Levy and I worked on an edited collection called Trust and Governance. That book was really a dialectic between those with a rational actor conception of trust and those with a relational conception of trust. But goodness, the field's come a long way since then. It really has matured. And this handbook on trust in public governance demonstrates the maturity of the field in now feeling comfortable letting 1,000 flowers bloom and being open to dipping into different conceptions of trust to answer different problems. The handbook invites us all to consider the context in which we think trust may be a critical variable in our own endeavours, and to dip into the handbook to find those contributions that might work best for us in our particular context, be that a research context or practice. With that in mind, I want to start by setting out the broad canvas for my own work. What do I see as the problem that trust can address, and why my interest in trust norms? An enduring interest of mine has been, how do we resist authority? And how do we learn not to resist authority? That authority may come from families, schools, workplaces, and for the latter part of my career, I've been particularly interested in government authority and regulatory authorities. A premise of my work is that we are reactive to threats to our freedom and autonomy. Of course, most of us compromise that freedom and autonomy every day without thinking about it and without even minding. Institutions socialize us into human beings who fit into our society and who do what is expected of us. But when institutions change, when new and unexpected demands are made on us, we are sensitized to noticing ways in which our freedom is curtailed. The COVID pandemic disrupted the ways in which many institutions functioned, and we all experienced the frustration of not being able to do what we wanted or expected to do. We found ourselves hostage to authorities charged with steering our societies through the pandemic. Now, a second premise of my work on resistance to authority is that human beings have basic psychological needs that must be fulfilled for their well-being and for society's well-being. Apart from autonomy, that is freedom to choose our preferred course of action, we need purposeful activity. We need to acquire skills and use them to mould the environment to suit us. Another way of talking about this is as human agency. So autonomy and agency are two of our basic psychological needs. The third is affiliation. We need connections with other people to function at our best. Autonomy, agency, and affiliation need to be primary considerations in how our institutions are designed. When institutions are allowed to ride roughshod over those needs, we see an upsurge in resistance that authorities, that is government and agencies in this particular case, have to deal with. So the question arises, how do governments know that it's happening, and how do they manage the problem? Bearing in mind that everyone makes compromises on autonomy, agency, and affiliation in order to live in society. When is that compromise so great that mental health and well-being suffer and our society starts to become dysfunctional, or at least starts to fragment? Now, the outward signs of these frustrations show up in what I call motivational postures, the signals we send to authority about how much social psychological distance we wish to place between us and them. That distance is represented by how much we like the authority, and secondly, how willing we are to defer to the authority. We communicate these postures in what we say and what we do. Most of the time, the power of government authorities nudges us towards liking and deference. Here we see the accommodating motivational postures of commitment and capitulation. Commitment signals to the authority, I believe in what you're doing, I'm on board. Capitulation signals, I really don't know much about what you're doing, but I'll do what you tell me to do. I don't want trouble. These postures remain strong even when institutions threaten change to our activities, providing we have resources to successfully adapt to the change. Providing our pathways to autonomy, agency, and affiliation are not blocked completely, we tend to be accommodating to the requests of government authorities, either through commitment or through capitulation. Sometimes, however, pathways are blocked. The chapter that I've written describes a public policy scandal in Australia that has become known as robo-debt. A faulty automated program issued faulty welfare debt notices to over 400,000 Australians. The fault was known to the government of the day, but because they wanted to balance their budget, they allowed the program to run until a federal government judgment ruled that it was illegal 4 years after its implementation, and it had been in pilot stage 6 months before that. Welfare recipients wasted no time in expressing dismay over these debt notices. But obstacles, totally inconsistent with normal and expected administrative practice, were put in place to nudge welfare recipients towards paying. There were many lower courts that warned that it was illegal. There was a national audit body that raised questions about it, but it wasn't until the federal court made the judgment of illegality that it stopped. Now, some of these obstacles were quite amazing, really. It was difficult for welfare recipients to contact government officers for an explanation of the debt. If a welfare recipient was successful in making contact with a government officer, they were told they had to prove that they did not have the debt by producing their past pay slips, in some cases going back several years. The welfare system in Australia is a self-report system where you tell the government how much income you've earned, and your welfare check is worked out on that basis. So getting paychecks was really difficult, as you can imagine, for people who were often in casual appointment and had changed many jobs. The third thing was that debts that were not paid quickly were passed on to debt collectors, and money was also garnished from tax returns without notifying welfare recipients first. Now, this flagrant abuse of power that contradicted the standards of integrity that Australians expected of their government and left welfare recipients disempowered, ashamed and isolated gave rise to oppositional motivational postures of resistance, disengagement and game playing. Now, resistance signals what you are doing is unfair and unreasonable, and we expect the problem to be fixed. We will raise our voice until you do fix it. That's how I would define resistant defiance and the posture of resistance. The posture of disengagement signals, I don't care what you're doing, I'm not responding, I'm not wasting my time dealing with you. It's a walking away response. Game playing, the third oppositional motivational posture, signals, you're not as smart as you think you are. I'm capable of using the law to challenge your authority. I will win against you. Now, we don't know much about the motivational posture of disengagement in the Robodebt case, although we do know that there were at least 2 suicides attributed to Robodebt and many more instances of mental illness, mainly among welfare recipients, but also, interestingly, among government officers who were forced to implement the program against their better judgment. The oppositional postures that were more visible to the public, particularly during the Royal Commission that was called when a new government was elected, were the postures of resistance and game playing. Resistance was displayed not only by welfare recipients and their families, but by flanks of supporters from civil society. Administrative lawyers who from the outset were voicing their objections to the program joined forces with the social movement #NotMyDebt to challenge the program successfully in the federal court. This was really the critical thing, this challenge in the federal court. But before that, there were many challenges in lower courts where individuals asserted their legal rights and they had their debts reduced or they had them wiped altogether. So that there was a degree of game playing going on at that level, but not at a level that the government would take any notice of. So all the while, little progress was made in holding the champions of the Robodebt scheme to account. It was really not until the Royal Commission that the Prime Minister, senior government officers and senior public servants were required to account for their decisions and actions. And it was here that the Australian public saw their elected representatives and public servants gameplay the procedures of the Royal Commission to avoid accountability. This was a really important and interesting finding to see how these postures could be also enacted by powers and authorities when they were held to account. Now, at this point, you will be asking, what does trust have to do with this, except from inferring that the Australian public will have lost trust in a government that knowingly used extortion against its own citizens to balance its budget? I argue in the chapter, and more recently in an article about citizen posturing to government's efforts to manage COVID, this is not the end of the trust story, but rather the beginning. Trust has to be rebuilt between citizens and government. As you would expect, that process involves institutions doing what they should do. The Royal Commission, for example, exposed the full story as best it could. False debt refunds, compensation and class actions have delivered justice as best they can. But as yet, those who allowed the program to operate in spite of warnings of its illegality and the harm it was causing have not been brought to justice. Furthermore, there is no reason to believe that it could not happen again. Now, one way this could play out, if we do not see a continuation of trust-restoring efforts by the Australian government, is a resurgence in the use of cash and a rise in the shadow economy, so that the government has no way of tracking people's income. And as I mentioned, our welfare system depends on self-reporting. It requires cooperation from citizens in that regard. And of course, once you self-report, that paper trail can be checked through bank statements, tax office declarations, and so on. Now, certainly there's a social movement in Australia encouraging people to use cash rather than card. And the shadow economy is growing, although there's no evidence, I should say, for linking robo-debt to either of these trends. But the point is, these social trends must be attractive to those who are badly affected by robo-debt and who do not trust the welfare system, but need it to survive. We're also hearing more reports of sovereign citizens using pseudo-law to fight the system. This is more generally, not specifically in relation to robo-debt, but in so doing, they're clogging up the legal system, the court system. These are all indicators of the motivational postures of disengagement and game playing, postures that I call dismissive defiance because they involve walking away from government, wanting a win against government, if not rendering government processes dysfunctional. They are likely to attract a response from government that's nothing short of muscular authoritarianism. So how do we avoid drifting into a situation where dismissive defiance grows to a point where states resort to domination of their citizens in order to assert their control and maintain a semblance of law and order? I argue that we turn our attention to the motivational posture of resistance, because defiance of government that is resistant is malleable to genuine efforts to make things right and build trust. The evidence suggests that when we allow resistant defiance to fester, it's likely to spiral into dismissive defiance. When dismissive defiance, that's the postures of disengagement and game playing, take hold, they become cultural norms, if you like. Well, norm may be too strong a word, but they become common ways of responding. Then we are facing a government that's lost its power to influence and persuade a substantial proportion of the population. So what is my evidence for what I'm saying? Well, this is where trust norms play an illuminating role. To return to the case of robo-debt, resistant defiance is still present. There's no question about that. Last night it was announced that the journalist Rick Morton won a Prime Minister's Literary Award for a book about robo-debt titled Mean Streak, with the subtitle a moral vacuum, a dodgy debt generator, and a multi-billion-dollar government shakedown. Quite a catchy title. Robo-debt has not gone away. Victorian Legal Aid, who were early to raise the red flag on robo-debt and who supported many complainants, have issued a next steps document. The need to embed co-design into the welfare system, to have an adequately resourced system that is accurate and responsive to needs, to have rights awareness in complaint and dispute resolution systems, and to have a social security system that owns mistakes and acts on failures. For this to happen, there has to be a willingness to rebuild trust from both sides, from citizenry and government. The key point here is that when trust is broken and resistant defiance is expressed by one or both parties, there nevertheless is willingness to make an effort to win back trust, because both parties want to be considered trustworthy. Resistant defiance, as opposed to dismissive defiance, signals not just betrayal by government, awareness of betrayal by government, but it also signals openness to repairing the trust relationship. Resistant defiance is the way citizens demand better treatment and performance from their government. The goal is to fix things up, not break them irreparably. Now, the act of being trustworthy is not left to chance. Trust norms guide this process. Trust norms are our shared understanding of what an authority or an individual must do to earn trust. That is, to be considered trustworthy. Trust norms are not about how much we trust each other. That's not it at all. And nor are they situation specific. They transcend situations like values. They're broad principles that people know they should follow if they are to be regarded as trustworthy by others. Now, in the earlier work that I did with Margaret Levy, the two types of trust norms I identified were exchange and communal trust norms. And that earlier work was about locating those trust norms in shared social values. So exchange trust norms are associated with security values and have the purpose of shoring up needs for safety and predictability in dealings with others, being efficient, reliable, accountable, keeping people informed and being consistent. Exchange trust norms underpin behaviours of doing what you say you will do and are expected to do. The element of no surprise is inherent in exchange trust norms. Communal trust norms, on the other hand, are related to the values that we place on cooperative relationships in a harmonious society, in a value system that prioritises harmony, social harmony. Communal trust norms include treating people with respect, understanding the position of others, being interested in the well-being of ordinary citizens, and consulting widely with different groups. Meeting communal trust norms for an authority means caring about the problems experienced by people and organisations, be they perpetrators or victims of harm. Now, in 6 Australian surveys conducted over a 20-year period, exchange and communal trust norms have been measured by asking participants how important each is in bringing about and maintaining trust in specific government institutions. Public rates of endorsement of trust norms as applied to government and related authorities are consistently high and have remained high over those 20 years. You get fluctuations. An example of that is a government being predictable was not something that was highly endorsed in COVID for obvious reasons. That wasn't, you wanted a government that was responsive during that period. So you get these fluctuations depending on what's happening at the time. But in general, over 90% use the response categories of important, very important, or essential, And that's what I use to justify their status as a norm for trustworthiness. Now, the important contribution that endorsement of trust norms makes to dealing with the posture of resistant defiance compared with dismissive postures of disengagement and game playing is that those who have walked away in a state of dismissive defiance, they say they have less hope that government can win their trust through abiding by trust norms. They've given up hope of building a relationship of trust with government. In contrast, for those in a state of resistant defiance, hope still exists. Trust norms can be used to provide a possible pathway forward, even though trust is very low. Now, many of the recommendations of the Victorian legal aid on how to repair the welfare system are implicitly talking about trust norms, actioning trust norms. Being heard, respectful and fair treatment, understanding and being knowledgeable about the process. These are abstract principles that lie behind embedded co-design, having an adequately resourced system that is accurate and responsive to needs, to have rights awareness in complaint and dispute resolution systems, to have a social security system that owns mistakes and acts on failures. So in conclusion, while trust norms seem remote from the action of governments and citizens, when violated, they have the potential to cause havoc. My argument is that in governance circles, we need to talk about the importance of honouring trust norms as often as we teach trust norms to children in our homes and classrooms. They are part of the social glue that helps us to recover from betrayals and system collapses. They're integral to the conversations between governments and citizens about what has gone wrong. They're integral to sincere apology and to establish sufficient trust to move forward to future cooperation. Thank you.
We have lost our coordinating or our moderator for the questions, I think. But let's move forward, I guess. So if there are any questions, just please raise your hand or let's hear it or put them in the chat if you want, and I will get to them that way. So anyone up for a first question, perhaps? Yes, Koen.
Hi, Valerie, thank you very much for an insightful talk. So the importance of trust norms is very clear, and you also signal the two groups which might relate differently to government, but a group which is hardest to reach. What can government still do to keep this group on board?
Yeah. I've argued, and this occurred in my work on tax. Deterrence actually plays a role in containing dismissive defiance, particularly game playing. And so I've argued that really government has to have good law and good capacity and the political will to use law to keep dismissive defiance in check. In other words, in dealing with dismissive defiance, there's nothing to be gained by being weak. And this ties into responsive regulation. Responsive regulation argues that, first of all, try to reason, try to use the skills of persuasion and influence. But if you see that that's not going to work, if you're dealing with just dismissive defiance and you can see the game playing, you really have to rise to the occasion of using a stronger incentives to gain compliance. Now, of course, the saying, talk softly but carry a big stick is very relevant here, and I've been thinking about this a lot in relation to our to social media, and the Australian government is wanting to control access to the media platforms, social media platforms for children under 16. So this is going to be very interesting to see, and I think we're going to have a lot of game playing here. So it's going to be very interesting to see if it's going to be bluffed by the Australian government or whether they're really going to rise to the occasion of to use the law and test the law to try to contain those large tech companies. And there's full realization, when I say that, there's full realization that really the tech companies have to, it's best if the tech companies will regulate themselves, have some commitment to vetting the material that's available to children, etc. So it's a watch this space, kind of see just how all of that unfolds. But with dismissive defiance, there is a need, I think, for good, strong law that can be used. But I'd like to make a distinction between that and what I call muscular authoritarianism, which I think is dangerous for governments, because not only does it fail, it alienates those people who were always committed to doing the right thing in the first place.
Mm-hmm. 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 Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Valerie. There was something with my sound and then I was kicked out of the system, but I'm back in.
Oh, good. I'm pleased.
Without the earplugs. Anyone else with a question? I don't see hands raised and I don't see anything in the chat. Anyone else with a question for Valerie? Was it clear? Does it trigger? Because we have in the Netherlands the toeslagenaffaire, the subsidy, and we have in England the post office case. So there are a lot of similarities in different countries. Simon, please go ahead.
Valerie, great to hear this again. I'm just puzzling about the link between reputation and trust. The reputation of agencies, particularly where it's been damaged by a Royal Commission or an inquiry like that. What does your research suggest in terms of how they might rebuild their reputation, and what's the linkage between that and their trust analysis?
Well, by turning around and showing and demonstrating their integrity. So if I were an advisor to the Australian government, and I'm not, let me make that clear, but if I were an advisor to the Prime Minister and to Tanya Plibersek, who is the Minister for Social Services, I'd say embrace the legal aid suggestions to immediately bring in groups for co-design, embed co-design into how our social welfare system works, to actually lead by showing trust in those groups that everyone wants a better system. And my argument would be that if you did that with integrity, if the government did that with integrity, they would win the day in rebuilding trust by following those recommendations of Victorian Legal Aid, and others have made similar recommendations, but Victorian Legal Aid has just put out a statement again reiterating those positions that they put forward to the Royal Commission. I understand why it's hard for government to do that, because they fear that they will be taken advantage of by those who are dismissively defiant and have the resources to cause trouble. I mean, that's the fear. But, you know, governments can't be fearful. They have to have courage to lead, and to lead through demonstrating integrity. Because if they don't, then the public simply becomes more and more disillusioned and thinks that their governments aren't capable of integrity. And I would argue that's dangerous. That plays into the long game of those who are dismissively defiant. And I mean, we have sovereign citizens sort of in the news media quite a lot at the moment, but the last thing a government or any of us would want is for us to be showing sympathy for sovereign citizens. But I don't think that's impossible. I think that can happen when governments don't lead and set out to prove their integrity. It's too much of an attitude of assuming because they're a government, because they've been elected, they automatically have our trust and they have integrity. That's not true. They are elected because the majority of the population think they're the best option at the time.
Thank you.
And for others in Australia, we have compulsory voting. But of course, in many countries, you don't have compulsory voting, and where you have low turnout rates, then I think you have a strong indication of how a government's integrity is perceived by the population. And I think it's something that we've all should be taking very, very seriously.
Thank you. And it reminds me of the importance of responsive regulation, that if you generically distrust citizens because there will be a group of dismissive defiers, then you're not in responsive regulation. But the challenge is to distinguish the groups.
Yes, that's right. And that's a really big challenge, Frederick. I don't underestimate how difficult that is, which is why I would make the argument that resistant defiance should be embraced. You know, it should be seen as the litmus test, if you like. And as soon as it's seen in the population over an issue, there should be action to talk about it, to set up deliberative democracy circles or meetings. I think the deliberative democracy literature has much to offer us here. I often in the area of regulation and where you have wrongdoing occurring, I would advocate strongly for restorative justice being used. But again, these things take courage from governments because they're giving up control to do those things. It's totally unacceptable for them to know the answer and set up a process which will deliver the answer they want. And yet that often is the logic that we see in government deliberations. That's got to be switched. There's got to be a whole lot more bravery to actually head off a rise in dismissive defiance.
Yeah, thank you very much. Anyone else has a question, a comment, or an example that you think also fits into as another case compared to robo-debt or COVID? The 28 people, don't feel hesitant. Okay. As I said, there's a lot of, and you mentioned restorative justice, and just culture is also the Sidney Dekker, a Dutch-Australian academic, also fits in there in that when something goes wrong, do you go for the repressive approach or for the restorative approach? And yeah, I think the more I work in this field, the more I realize how important that is and how difficult it is, because it really takes a mental change. The dominant way of working of governments around the world is very much the new public management. If we only have enough data, if we have a good enough system, then it'll work. But we don't have the data, we don't have good systems that work. It's too complex to be efficiently run by systems or automation. And a local ombudsman, Aris Zuurmond, who did his in the Netherlands, who did his PhD on Weber's bureaucracy, now says, yes, standardization is very important because it's efficient, but don't then try to get all the cases that aren't standard into the system. Make sure that you find those cases that aren't standard, and then have a separate process to solve that. Don't try to increase the rules to fix everything with the system. And I think that's a very important advice, because it also makes you realize when the systems don't work, which is what in Robodebt that would have come out more quickly.
Yes. Well, it was recognised relatively quickly, but the government would not listen. So in a way, it was the government showing dismissive defiance to the public, and it was only held to account when a higher authority, and that was the federal court, said no, we're not. This is not allowed. This is illegal. There were senior officials names were submitted in a closed and a sealed envelope to our National Corruption Authority, but as yet nothing has happened there. So that's why I say no one has been held to account. And going back to Kern's point, that someone should be held to account. I think that becomes critically important to bring dismissive defiance to heel in a way. Now, when I say that, I'm saying I embrace resistant defiance. I think that is good. It's the dismissive defiance that's destructive and wreaks havoc. That is the danger for all of us, because it's not easy to rebuild institutions when you've completely destroyed them. Far better to reform them.
Yeah, resistance defiance is the voice, whereas dismissive defiance is exit.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else? Yes, sorry, go on.
I was going to, I wanted to make sure I finished in time for questions. But one of the issues that is changing the scene, and I think government has been caught out in this regard, is social media and the speed with which information is shared. It probably is the case that for decades it was quite successful. A successful strategy for governments was to get their communications experts to write out a script for that to be sent to the legacy media, and that would be the message. That would be the way of suppressing complaints and resistant defiance, and comforting to those who were distressed about what was happening. That is no longer the case. Social media really rules. And so government hasn't quite come to terms with the fact that we're all talking about them, and not always in respectful, obedient ways. So that, I think, also explains this slow adjustment by government to accept that there are alternative authorities, that and those alternative authorities can be quite undermining of what government says and pursues.
It reminds me of a case by one of the co-authors. She did her PhD in the book, one of the authors in the book, Neve Daly. She did her PhD on an Irish case, where she showed the role of victims on social media to become a focal point and therefore put pressure on government. So there are different ways of holding government to account.
Yes.
I can recommend that
Chapter.
one of the articles. Yeah. Now the chapter is more general on trust repair in public sector agencies, but her PhD is she won a prize on the Trust conference this just before the summer. If there's no one else with a question or a comment or a thought, I think we will finish by thanking Valerie for her very insightful presentation and further thoughts in the Q&A. And I hope to see you all on the 22nd of October for the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much,
very much.
Valerie.
Thank you for
Thank
the
you all to
opportunity.
attend.